His master's voice, or HMV Records, was the place to be in Pitt Street in Sydney when I was a much younger man. Well, in this episode, we are going to consider the market's voice when it comes to Scope 3 emissions. Because, again, this is the place to be when you want to know exactly how businesses are dealing with Scope 3 emissions in the real world. So what would prompt a business to report their Scope 3 emissions ahead of any need that's been enforced upon them by either a stock market or the country in which they're operating in? Well, the first driver is who their end customer is. Sometimes we think of supply chains purely from the perspective that we have and where we're operating. However, there are some supply chains that are delivering a part, semi-finished good, into another supply chain for that to then be made into the completed good that's then sold to the consumer. So in those instances, we have businesses that now need to report on Scope 3 because those emissions are included in the total emissions of that completed finished good. Now, if that company is listed, that is absolutely a requirement. That's point one there. The second point is that even if the company is listed and they're not required to do Scope 3, they still may be building up their database of Scope 3 emissions for their supply chain, so they make it a requirement for all of their suppliers to provide that information. The third point there is about certifications, and EcoVadis is just an example. There could be an instance where the person is selling into a company that is getting certified, and as a consequence, to reach that certification, they require emissions data from inputs into their business. And then last, it now becomes a requirement to participate in a tender. So you may hold the contract for a piece of business and you go back to secure that. Now, that company might award that contract, say, for 3 years. At the beginning of the contract, they may have no need to capture Scope 3 emissions data from you. However, at some point within that 3-year time frame, they will. So they want to make sure everyone that's participating in that tender is fully aware that they will need to be ready for that reporting and it not to be a surprise. So that's these critical reasons for the end customer. Now, for a business themselves, so irrespective of who they sell to, these are the reasons we're seeing that they're already recording Scope 3 emissions. The first is that they have government contracts, and governments act very differently to other private enterprises, and they may have targets that need to be met. The other is that they're getting certified themselves, so they need to have this reporting in place in order to achieve the highest grading they can for that period. Outside of actually being certified, they just have sustainability goals, and in order to meet those, Scope 3 transport and distribution are some of the easier to hit because, as we've previously stated, you're already getting the transportation reports to do the calculations from. For other customers, this is just what they're doing. The Scope 3 emissions piece is done for the transportation, whether it's international or domestic. Now it's about adding in the nodes and coming up with calculations for a warehouse, for a separate 3PL, for any operation that would be classified as a node in the supply chain, and developing an emissions factor for them. And so what they're now doing is creating a more complete picture of their Scope 3 emissions end to end in their supply chain. In the illustrious words of AC/DC, are you ready? Well, I think you are ready, but to make sure, you better head over to episode 5, where we consider the data requirements for reporting Scope 3 emissions in the supply chain.